Coming up on today's show, Dr. Allison Ash is a trauma-informed sex and intimacy coach and educator, lecturer at Stanford University, author, and founder of TurnOn.Love. As a sociologist with a PhD from Stanford, Dr. Ash has a comprehensive understanding of the complex societal challenges that often lead to unsatisfying and disempowering sexual experiences. Dr. Ash designs workshops, courses, and retreats and offers individuals and couples coaching to give others the tools to discover their desires and confidently pursue them. She invites you to turn on pleasure, intimacy, and love at www.turnon.love. Welcome to Loving Without Boundaries, where we hear inspiring stories, share actionable advice, and talk about the challenges and the joys of ethical non-monogamy and polyamory. I'm your host, Kitty Chamberliss. Coming up after the break, my conversation with Dr. Allison Ash. The Loving Without Boundaries podcast is proudly brought to you by altplayground.net. Alt Playground is all about inclusivity in the lifestyle, which is amazing and one of the things I love about Alt Playground. That's why they offer 9 different gender identities, 9 relationship statuses, including consensual non-monogamy and polyamory, and 13 sexual orientations. APG's mission is to provide a fun and inclusive environment for all consensually non-monogamous and sexually open people. And that's one of the amazing things about Alt Playground and why I do invite you to check them out. They are really working to be as inclusive as possible in the lifestyle. Welcome back to Loving Without Boundaries, where I am truly stoked to be here with Dr. Allison Ash. And this is really our first big conversation, but I'm totally thrilled to have it. Dr. Allison Ash reached out to me over email, and I've been really looking forward to conducting this interview and learning more about your work. So welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Kitty. I'm really glad to be here.
That's awesome. I'm glad you're here too. So I've shared, of course, your incredible bio with everyone, but I'd love it if you'd just tell us a little bit about yourself in your own words.
Sure. So I work as a sex and intimacy coach and educator. And what that really means is I teach a wide range of workshops and classes and work with individuals and couples and groups to help them learn how to create and sustain physical, sexual, and emotional intimacy. And in that, there's kind of 2 big pathways that we take. One of them is exploring various obstacles that we all experience in creating intimacy. So that could be things like fear, or not knowing how to be vulnerable and share your emotions, or navigating experiences of shame, things like that. And then the other avenue tends to be a lot about skill building, because I think so many of us feel inadequate or insecure because we are missing essential education around skill building. Intimacy is a skill, and any skill we can learn and master with practice, but we just don't know where to get that information. And so there's a practical angle, but then there's also the deeply interpersonal and intrapersonal angle to explore some of the ways that, this is just so hardwired into our psyche and way of being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really resonates with me. I have a feeling this is going to be a fascinating conversation because that really resonates with me, and I believe the same things, and that's a lot of the ways that I'm helping people as well. And I love how you kind of broke it down into the kind of 1-step, 2-step. Sometimes you're helping people release shame and then work on their skills. And I love how you shared that. Yeah, I mean, intimacy is a skill, and it's something that we can all learn, and you're really the conduit and the guide helping them along the journey.
Yes, thanks. I love the way that you phrased that. And I think it is so important to have this education be available in this kind of really relational dynamic, because intimacy is a relational skill. So it's hard to learn it just from a book or even a podcast. We need to learn it in connection and in relationship with other people. And so when I'm helping my students or when I'm helping my clients build these skills, we're actually also building connection with each other, which is part of why I love this work so much.
That's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. I love the way you said that. And I'm a big believer too. And yeah, like rising tides lift all boats. And so when we're learning together, together is better. It's also a heck of a lot more fun, but it also helps anchor what you're learning. So that's beautiful that you see. It sounds like you have some of those same philosophies.
Yes, I think experiential education is definitely where it's at.
I love that. So I'd love to just go back in time just for a brief moment and get to know you a little bit better. So when you were, whatever moment that was there a light bulb moment where you realized that following a very traditional path in your relationships and even in your work, because your work is quite unique, that you realized that you wanted to live your relationships, maybe even your life, coloring outside of the lines and maybe experimenting with some form of consensual non-monogamy? What did that look like?
I love this question. And I would have to say that my sexual journey and exploration has been one that has been full of growth. And I think in a lot of ways, I've used my relationships and explorations and interactions as a way to explore myself. And I think I did that because I grew up without having much intimacy modeled for me, not within my family structure. And my parents didn't have very many friends at all. So I didn't have many adults to uh, model myself after. And I think that one of the most important experiences in my own development was in my early 20s when I met this incredible group of friends who were about 10 years older, and we're all practicing non monogamy to various degrees and in various ways. And the group sex experiences and the experiences I had dating some of those couples were so profound for me, because I think that there's no better way to learn about the kind of relationships that you want, the kind of relationship structures that you want, and how to create intimacy than getting to have these wonderful transmissions happening by being in connection with people that inspired me, and the relationships were so uh, deeply moving for me to witness.
I love that. What an amazing way to embark on your journey. I love that. I'm just going to jump into group sex and have a really profound experience in my early 20s. That's awesome.
Well, I have to tell you, there were a lot of not profound experiences that led up to those moments for sure. There's no doubt about it. And I think that there's always an interesting angle of being an academic and being so sex positive and having such a high sex drive, because, of course, my individual explorations were mirroring a lot of my academic explorations. And I think that there's an interesting way that they kind of fed and informed one another.
That's fascinating. And I love just getting to know you because you're very easy to talk to, but I can also really resonate and relate to when you said that you didn't really have many intimacy models when you were growing up. I can definitely relate to that as well. My parents were not affectionate and they didn't even sleep in the same bedroom, if you can believe that. And it was just the way their relationship worked. And similar to you, they didn't have a ton of friends. So I think it's interesting that you were able to note that and then, have that kind of epiphany of, well, but that's not the way I am. Like I want to have intimacy and I want to have sexual exploration. And then you were lucky enough to join that experience, to have that at such a pretty young age. Whereas like, that's where our paths would differ is I didn't really start exploring in that way until say my 30s, so my mid to late 30s, whereas you were in your 20s. So I'm really happy for you that you got to have that experience and some of those realizations early on.
I'm just really blessed that I moved to the Bay Area, where there's just such a amazing community and diverse culture of folks that are practicing in so many different kinds of ways of being and lifestyles and orientations. And it's been such an important part of my development is to get to a place where people are living the kind of lifestyle that I might want to live.
Mm. Are you familiar with the quote from Steve Jobs that we can't connect the dots moving forward? We can only connect them looking back?
And I am. I love that quote.
I love that quote too. And the reason I bring it up is I first went to the Bay Area when I was roughly 24. So maybe around the same time that you're describing you were at age wise. And I didn't even know back then what polyamory or consensual non monogamy was. I was just deeply attracted to the energy and the vibe. And we did go to, I think it was a strip club. And I decided, I was like, I want to move here. This is amazing. And I couldn't make it happen. I couldn't figure out how to move from the East Coast to the West Coast. It was just so expensive. But looking back, I realized that was me on a much slower journey than you were on. You were kind of like on a fast track journey of figuring out how to live, my most authentic life and explore my sexuality. But all I had was an inkling that I liked San Francisco, and that was all I had back then. But it's such an incredibly free, beautiful, such vibrant energy I find in the San Francisco area. I love it. So that's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so interesting when we look back at our journeys and the different paths that we could have taken, and also just, realizing that we couldn't be where we are today without all of those building blocks that we had
Mm.
to go through to get there. And so, I really celebrate that you got to your light bulb moment when you did.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it led me to be so passionate about, having this conversation with you and creating a platform where you and I get to even, talk about intimacy and sex this is great. So
What a huge gift.
I know it's great. So that's a nice segue into, tell me a little bit more about how your journey led you to do the work that you're doing today. What did that look like?
Well, I would have to say that it probably started back in high school. I was sexually assaulted, and that was just a really challenging experience for me to figure out how to process that experience. This is before rape culture was rape culture. It wasn't even really, I didn't really understand it as rape until much later when I was actually studying about rape and rape culture and secondary victimization and all of these things that I was getting ready to teach, and then processing these experiences that had happened to me, almost a decade earlier. It was a very trippy experience to say the
Mm,
least, but I think that I bring that up because I knew what it meant to be sexually disempowered. I knew what it meant to feel objectified and used and not in control of my body and my desires and my pleasure, my autonomy and sovereignty in a way that I wanted. And I think that I got very interested in studying sex and gender and feminism. And what was so powerful for me about studying these topics was getting to understand some of the social processes that are at play. As a sociologist, I was studying how is our society structured to create disempowering experiences, and not just for women, but for people of all genders and all sexual orientations, because I have to tell you, patriarchy really doesn't serve anyone in this regard.
mm.
And then studying this from an academic perspective and realizing that there's so much juice here that can be taken out of the research context and apply to a real life practical lens of how do we use this information to create real world change on an individual level, and then from there on a societal level. And so I think that's when I decided I wanted to leave academia and start doing coaching and education on my own. Was that I so grateful to the researchers out there that thank you for your work. And I knew that my purpose in life was to take that work and use that in my practice to help create change on a real interactional level.
Wow, what an amazing journey. And I just love how you described all that. And first off, of course, I'm so sorry that you had that experience of getting raped. But I love how you turn that around and you learned how to, what can I take from that experience and how can I learn about it, learn about myself. And now with your work, you're paying it forward in such a beautiful and amazing way. And then, secondly, thank you for, I'm so grateful, that you did take that traumatic experience and figure out, I'm going to help create positive change in the world and help other people in a really powerful and an impactful and meaningful way, that not only I'm sure is rewarding for you, but is incredibly helpful for everyone that you serve. So thank you for the amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for that acknowledgement. And yeah, I do think that for me, that has been a big and probably maybe one of the final steps of healing my trauma was using those experiences and all the learnings and all of the hard fought insights that I've gained to help other people. And I think that for so many of us, we want to have that experience of being able to use our trials to help the next one.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And so when you think about the work that you do and the intimacy, being an intimacy coach, one question that came to mind that I wanted to ask you is, and this has even come up in my own work, is sometimes people don't give themselves permission to fantasize, whether they think it's taboo, or I often tell people that I'm a recovering Catholic. And so I was literally taught as a young girl that if I even, thought about sex, which really is fantasy, right?
Hmm.
That, I would go blind or I was going to go to hell. And it took me, decades to kind of unravel some of that and figure out what my values really were and to start to give myself permission, whether it was to fantasize or to pleasure myself and masturbate and things of that nature. But it brings me to a question that I think you're the perfect person to ask, which is, why do humans fantasize? Why do we do that? What's the benefit, or tell me more about that.
Hmm. Well, people fantasize for a lot of reasons. And I think that there's a couple of cool angles to take when answering this question. And one is to talk about it from a research perspective. So, a PhD researcher, Justin, I believe it's pronounced Lemiller, did a survey of over 4,000 folks. And he found that the most common reasons people fantasize are to experience arousal, duh, but also because we're curious about different sexual sensations. We want to meet unfulfilled needs, to escape reality, to explore a sexual taboo, to plot out a future sexual encounter, as a way to relax or reduce anxiety, as a way to feel more sexually confident, or just simply because we're bored. So there's a lot of reasons why we fantasize. But if we want to go a level deeper than just kind of that surface, like why we might tell somebody that we fantasize, I think at a deeper psychological level, we fantasize to process challenging and conflicting experiences and feelings and emotions. So
Mm,
we start fantasizing like by daydreaming as little kids about that opportunity when we're finally going to be able to see over the counter at the bakery all the really good things, or that moment when we're going to be free and get to stay up as late as we want and eat as much candy as we want, right? These very simple daydreams that we have as children are ways of navigating challenging and uncomfortable experiences. And I think that we as we fantasize as adults, oftentimes there is that inherent nature of obstacles and kind of conflict and challenging feelings that we get to work out in a way that feels empowering because our fantasies are within our control.
mm, mm,
And so it's like BDSM, right? Why might somebody want to use BDSM for healing? Well, because you get to actually have a lot of control in how you structure these scenes. The same thing is true even with a greater extent when the fantasies are in your own mind. We can talk about what happens when you want to share them a little bit later. But I think that there's just this deep kind of emotional processing that can happen through fantasy.
mm. That's all Amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. And it makes a lot of sense to me. And I love how you equated, how we would fantasize as children and bringing that forward to fantasizing as adults, and how I love how you explained that it is a way to feel empowered because we're controlling a little bit what it looks like. But I love how you walked it out even to real life, how, say, you do want to have a BDSM scene, but you can talk about the scene ahead of time and almost plot it out like a play, so to speak, to maybe help you get, your needs met, or like you said, maybe even to help process or heal something from the past. I love that.
That's right. And part of what's so great about fantasizing is, I mean, I have so many fantasies, Kitty, that I don't ever want to have happen in real life. And I have also a bunch of fantasies I really hope will happen in real life. But I think that it's very normal and healthy to have these fantasies that we really want to play out in our mind and in our mind alone. And that is such a liberating way to approach fantasies. It's so limiting to think about uh, fantasies having to be something that you would really want to have happen, because then you get stuck in that whole mental debate of, well, but would this do good and would this feel good, or how would that make them feel, and what would
Mhm.
it feel like the next morning? But in your fantasy world, you don't have to worry about any of that. You don't have to worry about ethical considerations or moral considerations or
Mhm.
what your own gender orientation is or your expectations of you. You get to just be fully liberated and
Mhm.
allow your creative mind to build this erotic material from whatever inspiration you might have.
Wow, I love the passion and the enthusiasm with which you talk about this topic. It's so fun. And it's interesting to me, like, again, kind of looking back over my own life. I started out, being very vanilla because that's all I knew. And somewhere along the lines, I wanted to ask how this kind of relates in a way to porn, because there was a period where I explored a lot of girl on girl porn. And at first I thought it was just me fantasizing, but in some ways it was me kind of processing what would that experience be like. And then eventually, I did get to enjoy the experience of making love to another woman, and it was amazing. Right?
I know it is.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
celebrate
It was absolutely amazing.
that.
And now, like, it's almost like watching. I love watching porn, and I love talking about porn, and I'm not ashamed of it in any way. And for me, it's kind of like watching even my own process. Like, I love watching gangbang porn, but I'm not 100% sure I ever want to do that. But it's very erotic to watch it. You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
speaking of fantasy, I really love like Japanese anime porn, or like animated monster porn.
Mhm.
And clearly that's fantasy, which is so fun, but it's a way to um, get aroused and kind of explore your own sexuality. But I guess that's one question I have for you is, how does, like, a lot of people talk about porn addiction, right?
Mhm.
So how does fantasy play into porn, and when is that healthy and when does it maybe not go to a healthy place?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think that it's really valuable to expose ourselves to erotic content because we need inspiration. We don't draw creativity out of thin air. We're constantly being impacted by the things that we're exposed to and draw our inspiration from that. And porn is one form of erotica. There's also audio porn, and there are porn podcasts now, and there's visuals and stills, and there's you can listen to sounds of people masturbating and having sex. There's so many short stories and graphic novels that are out there, and so whatever medium you want to consume, I think it's really valuable to expose yourself to what's out there. Now, there's a couple of caveats I want to say. The first is I do think that when you want to really build your fantasy muscles, it's helpful to turn off visual porn and expose yourself to more auditory or written forms of erotica, because it allows your imagination to start to fill in the blanks a little bit. It's a nice,
Mm.
like, scaffolding step to move from porn into fantasizing. And the other
That's
thing that I would
beautiful.
say is that uh, separate your exploration phase from your getting it on phase. Because whenever, as you know, you're exploring porn or any other medium of erotica, you're going to encounter a lot that you don't like along the way of finding the things that you do like. And some of those things that you don't like could be big turnoffs. And so if you're doing that when you're trying to get off, it might be a bit of a roller coaster experience in a not appealing way. So what I like to do is I like to have times where I'm just all about the exploration and finding things that I like. And I have a little list that I keep so that when I just want to get off, I go to my list of favorites. And sometimes, of course, those two things end up blending and merging, but I think it can be helpful to know, is this an exploration time or is this I want to just have as much pleasure as I can have time?
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. I love that distinction, including that idea of turning off visual porn. And I've actually had a wonderful person on the podcast recently named Lexi Silver, who wrote a book called The Mating Season. And I'm actually in the process of working my way through reading all of the stories now, and they're really fascinating. And that's so dead on what you said, that sometimes having like not having all the visuals where everything's kind of there, 100%, and reading more about erotica is so powerful. Because I love what you said, that your mind starts to fill in the blanks, and your mind gets to fill in the blanks any way they want, which is another form of using your imagination and enjoying fantasy.
That's right. Yeah.
I love that. Another thing I wanted to ask is, I study a lot with Dr. Joe Dispenza and meditation and like visioning and build the vision. And so I wondered, how much is there an overlap of fantasy with possibly creating a vision for something that you want to happen, and manifesting it? Does that come into play in your work, or when in your studies of fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're fantasizing about something, it makes it feel less foreign, more accessible. Oftentimes, when I'm working with couples who want to explore having a threesome or a group sex experience, but they haven't done it yet, I
Hmm.
suggest that they build a fantasy together or a couple versions of fantasies together of what that might look like. And in that process, they get to figure out, what do they find hot? What might be scary? How can they imagine navigating certain situations? What are positions or looks or ways of touching or moments that they find particularly erotic? And I think that it's a wonderful scaffolding step because it's going to make it easier when you want to have that real experience. And
Hmm.
so I think in that way, fantasizing can make it more accessible to have these experiences in real life. But in another way, fantasizing is really important because there is a very clear connection in the brain between sensations and pleasure. And
Mm.
so, in other words, if you start thinking about somebody pleasuring your genitals, just thinking about it, the pleasure centers in your brain are going to light up. And
Wow.
so, the more that you fantasize and connect fantasies with sensations, the more you're strengthening these neural pathways and connections between your mind and your body and pleasure. And this is where mindful masturbation and mindful sex also really come in, because it helps you notice the sensations that are happening in your body more. I think that when we're drawing from erotic material, we can draw from the sensations we're experiencing. We can draw from our fantasies. We can draw from memories or maybe porn that we're watching. And I
Mm.
think having access to all of that strengthens our capacity to experience as much pleasure as we can, and realizing that mindful masturbation and sex and fantasizing support each other by strengthening these neural pathways is a really like exciting new cutting edge a way that research is really informing how our brain and sex interact.
That is absolutely fascinating. I love that. It makes me just think about, like, in a way, it's actually a form of self-care, and I don't know that a lot of people think of it that way, but that's how, the way you're describing it, it sounds to me, and also the way it even feels for me. Like, it's like giving yourself a pleasurable time out But when you talk about strengthening those neural pathways, I mean, it sounds like it's actually like healthy for the brain, literally. And you're also kind of creating better energy, like a better like frequency and vibration. And again, I really have that belief that like energy attracts like energy. So if you're kind of feeding that pleasure center and feeding, the self-care, kind of putting that out there in the world, you might start attracting to you other people who kind of want to play in that frequency with you, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think that sex, whether it's solo or partnered or group, can be incredibly regulating for the nervous system, which is what self care is all about. And I
Mm,
think that I know, at least personally, I was addicted to intensity when it came to sex for a lot of my life. And part of what has been so great about mindful masturbation and sex is I've learned a lot about how wonderful slowness and subtlety can be.
I love how everything that you shared there, Allison, in terms of that the concept of mindful masturbation, especially coming from my background where I was taught you're not even allowed to masturbate, let alone talking about having mindful masturbation. And that's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about that before, that this type of self-care of fantasy is, and all self-care is really about regulating our nervous system. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm a junkie when it comes to studying the nervous system and learning how to care for my nervous system because that wasn't something that I was taught growing up. And I think that that's so important for healthy intimacy is to be able to know when we need some of that care, whether that's self care on our own or co regulation by engaging in cuddling or talking or eye gazing or sex with somebody else, when that's going to be really beneficial so that we're not operating out of our window of tolerance when we're in a state of enduring and white knuckle gripping and just uh, incapacitated to be able to really have the skill set that we need to keep intimacy alive.
Hmm. That's amazing. So when we think about, we've talked already about a lot of the different benefits of fantasizing. Is there any that we didn't cover that you would like to share?
Well, I think that another one that ties on so beautifully to what you were sharing earlier about being a recovering Catholic is that I think fantasizing can be a wonderful way that we can reclaim experiences that were shamed or shunned
Mm,
or stigmatized. And that could be because of our religious upbringing or the values of our family or community or culture. It could be the way that society has institutionalized sexism and misogyny and homophobia and heteronormativity and all of these belief systems that influence the way that we relate to our own desires. And so I think that part of learning how to fantasize if it's hard for you is understanding the way that shame has prevented you from allowing your mind to go there. And then
mm,
through getting support and oftentimes it's through sharing fantasies with people that aren't going to reject you and that are going to help you explore them with acceptance because the fear of shame is rejection. So the antidote is acceptance and belonging. And
mhm.
so giving a lot of acceptance and belonging and helping somebody to explore their fantasies is also helping them to release the shame that they have around their desires. And that process can be so empowering. It's what a way to reclaim what turns you on.
Mhm. That's incredible. Yeah, and I think there's, at least in my work, I definitely see a lot of people who are working through shame, and I think it's powerful to understand in this context that fantasy is a way to work through that, or maybe to heal things from the past. I think that's really beautiful, and it's also a way to feel empowered because, as you said, it is empowering to fantasize because you're giving yourself permission in some ways to experience pleasure, or giving yourself permission to release shame or to heal the past or to give yourself acceptance and belonging. So I think
Mhm.
that's amazing.
Mm.
What are some of the most common fantasies that you must have some ideas on that given the work that you do?
Yeah. I think a lot of people fantasize about non monogamy or multi partnered sex experiences, whether it's threesomes or group sex. I think that the idea of multiple people wanting to have sex with you at the same time is hot for a lot of reasons. I mean, just the sensory input of multiple hands and mouths is appealing. And and it's interesting. Research shows that when people fantasize about non-monogamy, people that are practicing monogamy but are fantasizing about it, less than 5.5% said cheating was arousing. So most people are fantasizing about consensual and ethical non-monogamy, which I think
How
is
fascinating. That is
yeah,
fascinating.
it is interesting.
Yeah.
And then folks are also often fantasizing about things related to power, control, BDSM, rough sex, and that includes both dominance and submission. I think it can feel hot to not have to be in control or to be in complete authority.
Hmm.
I think another common category is around novelty and variety and adventure. So maybe new places or new sex acts, new people. Adrenaline in and of itself can be really arousing for some people.
Hmm.
There's a lot of folks that have the passion romance fantasies, like that does exist outside of the movie sphere. And I think that that makes sense because it demonstrates this willingness to put in effort and time and resources, and that can have people feel so special and important. Um, there's the taboo and forbidden sex type of fantasies. So the things that you shouldn't or can't have always can feel extra appealing. So that could be things like licking feet, worshiping leather, latex, experiences of voyeurism or exhibitionism, things like that. And then
Hmm.
I would say the last common category tends to be erotic flexibility. So that's things like gender bending or sexual fluidity fantasies. This idea of getting to explore things that are inconsistent with your identities can be really fun and hot and empowering and are quite common.
Hmm. So much resonated with me that you shared that. I love how you kind of broke it down into the different categories. So I'll just touch on some of them. And I love how the last one you shared was kind of that gender bender fantasy, because when I think of, like, I joke around, I wrote a blog post about this, that the first time I ever had sex was with Prince, the artist formerly known as Prince. May he rest in peace. And I say it jokingly because it was all in my mind, right? It was all just a fantasy. I was listening to the Controversy album and then eventually the Purple Rain album. And one of the things I loved about Prince was just what a fearless badass he was, including the gender bender nature of the way he dressed with the frilly, the frilly shirts and the hair, all of it. And I just found that so hot. And I was only like, 15 years old, but it was my first time, I think, that I was giving myself, right, permission to fantasize like that. And it was about a gender bender music, like, talented virtuoso like Prince. you know?
Mm-hmm.
I love that. And I also love how you shared that we might have fantasies about being not in control, like running my own business. That's definitely something that I find very erotic, is leaning into that subspace and just saying, you know what, I made like 30 decisions today, and a lot of them are really hard decisions, and I'm done making decisions. Now I just want to be told what to do, you
You
know?
and me both.
Yeah, it's like a relief.
Yeah.
But it's also really fun, yeah, to even in the bedroom kind of switch roles, like who has the masculine energy and that kind of power position, and who has kind of more of the feminine energy, or maybe that kind of more nurturing role in that moment, and to kind of flip flop, or the way some people might describe that as being a switch. And I love what you said too about fantasizing even about the romance part. Maybe people don't feel like they have, like, romance is dead or chivalry is dead. And so the way you can, instead of, kind of forcing other people to do your bidding, just allow yourself to kind of fantasize about exactly how you want that to play out. And I think that's fascinating. I did not know that I've studied cheating and why people cheat. And a lot of times folks share with me that it's partly the thrill, the thrill of cheating and the thrill of, what if we get caught? But I love that the statistics actually are more around people fantasizing about it's all consensual. There is no taboo. We're doing this with acceptance and love. I think that's
Mhm.
fascinating. And
Mhm.
also really kind of encouraging in some ways to hear that, because of course cheating can cause so much hurt and pain and disruption, so it's nice to almost hear like people are kind of visioning about like, what if we lived in a world, like the movie announcer, in a world where consensual monogamy is totally accepted by everyone, what would that look like? Um, that's really
It,
cool. I love hearing that.
it is promising.
Yeah, it is. We touched a little bit on shame earlier. Is there other ways that shame plays out in our ability to fantasize that we didn't touch on?
Well, I think that there's a gendered component as well because for a lot of women, right, we have been the object of desire,
Hmm.
but that's very different than um, being the owner, the experiencer of desire. And so we can have shame around our own desires and around what that even around how hard it is to explore our own desires can be a source of shame. And so I just want to say that for whatever reason, whether it's because of your gender or your upbringing, that if shame is making it challenging for you to fantasize, there's kind of like this there's this meta perspective of I feel ashamed that this is hard, right? The acronym for shame is should have already mastered everything,
Oh my
right?
goodness, I never heard that.
And so we can feel shame because it's hard to fantasize about what we're fantasizing about. And of course, we can feel shame about both at the same time. And so I think that bringing in self compassion around the ways that we haven't mastered everything yet is really useful. But then
Mhm.
also bringing in this sense of questioning around some of the belief systems that we have ingrained in ourselves and choosing, does that really fit for me? Do I want to continue to subscribe to those belief systems, or do I want to let myself explore my desires and allow my fantasies to be part of that? So there's kind of these both angles that shame can show up.
Mhm. That's fascinating. And I love that acronym. I can't believe I've never heard that before. Should have already mastered everything. Yeah, one of my mentors, she talks about shame as the cosmic joke. Like we're not when we're born, we don't know what shame is. It doesn't even compute, and it's almost something that we're taught. And it's like the myth of perfection. Like perfection is also like a myth. It doesn't exist, and shame is almost, I mean, it's a valid emotion, but it's almost like something that we're taught, and it kind of thrives in secrecy. So I
That's
love,
true.
yeah.
And
I,
shame is something that babies learn really, really at a very young age from the ways that they're touched and the looks that they're given. It's just
mm,
incredible how early shame gets communicated. And we're not born with the voice of our inner critic. We develop that voice because the experience of being shamed is so painful and scary that we would rather be our first line of defense and shame ourselves first so that we behave
wow.
appropriately so that we don't risk being rejected and shamed by others. And then, of
Mm,
course, that voice just runs amok and grabs the megaphone in our mind and doesn't want to share the space. And I think that that's when it can become really destructive. But of course, we do need healthy experiences of shame so that we can um, continue to act in integrity with our values.
mhm. Yeah, so much gold in what you just shared there. I love especially that we'll shame ourselves in an effort to almost protect ourselves against rejection from others. So we'll try and shame ourselves first to avoid that judgment. That's fascinating.
Mhm. Yeah.
I never thought of it that way, but I think that makes total sense. Um, so yeah, so what tips do you maybe have for our amazing listeners who want to fantasize more but don't know where or how to start?
Well, I would say the first thing is to create a setting that's going to be conducive. And I would say the number one important thing to consider is privacy. If you have a lot of anxiety about being interrupted, it's going to be hard to create the mental safety that you need to allow yourself to fantasize. So that might mean locking the door, turning your phone off, doing it in times when you know that nobody is home, putting a do not disturb sign on your door, whatever it is that you need so that you can claim that space of privacy.
Mhm.
And also set the mood for yourself. Make it appealing to your senses. It's really hard to fantasize in a sterile environment. It's much easier to fantasize in a place and setting where you would want to get it on. So, showers, beds, think about having sexy music, nice lighting, yummy smells, other things that are going to be appealing and arousing to your senses because any kind of pleasure helps lead to sexual pleasure. So if it's pleasing to your senses, it paves the way for sexual pleasure.
Mhm. I love that. I love that kind of just creating the kind of like the sacred space. And
Mhm.
I'm sure that also helps reduce shame. Like even when I think back to that story I was describing when I was in my mind having sex with Prince, I didn't have a lot of privacy. I was constantly petrified about my parents walking in because we didn't have like locks on our doors.
Mhm.
And that inhibits the freedom to really go there, so to speak.
That's
But
right.
as an adult, normally we would have more control over our living arrangements or our atmosphere or our ability to have some autonomy about our space. That's awesome.
Mhm.
And one thing that I think that's really true is, and I've seen with people that I talk to, is that sharing fantasies can be really terrifying. For example, if we were really going outside of the lines, like maybe we're doing something gender bender, or we're thought of as like a the alpha male, and the fantasy is something completely submissive, and that's terrifying to share, or something along those lines, or maybe it's really kinky or deep into the BDS scene. Do you have any suggestions for how to make that feel easier to be able to share our fantasies?
Yeah, I do. I think the first thing is to realize that there are some fantasies that you want to share, and there are some fantasies that you might not ever want to share with somebody, and that's totally okay. You don't have to share your fantasies with your partner or lover. But if
Hmm.
you want to, I think that there are certainly things that you can do to increase safety. And the first is to remind them that there's no obligation for them to do anything by you
Hmm.
sharing your fantasy, that you just want to share something that you think is hot.
Hmm.
Um, you might give them a little bit of direction around what would feel really good for you in terms of their response. So something like, I want to share this fantasy with you. I'm really nervous. I haven't shared it before. And I'm really hoping that you can find the things in it that you think are hot and celebrate them. And then if you don't think it's hot, that maybe you can just hold that in because I feel really scared that if you don't think it's hot, I'm going to feel really embarrassed and ashamed for sharing it with you. And so it's okay if you don't want to do it, but can you not yuck my yum?
Hmm.
Right. And
I
so
love that.
that can create safety for both people because it can be, if you're telling me your fantasy kitty and you have some idea about how it would be really hot for me to receive it, I want
Hmm.
to know. I want to make it comfortable and safe for you. So it actually helps both people to give that kind of information.
Mm.
And then the other thing that I think is so important is to realize that when it comes to our fantasies, I think the most important thing is to realize that all your fantasies help you feel certain emotions. And that's ultimately, I think, what we're craving and going after. So maybe I want to have this experience of feeling in control. And so I have a variety of dominating fantasies. Or maybe I feel like I really want to be fought over and chosen. And so I have fantasies around people lining up to have sex with me or gangbangs or group sex experiences.
Mm.
But the thing is that even if I'm in a monogamous relationship, if I know that the feeling that I'm wanting is to feel fought over and chosen, we can come up with so many ways of creating that feeling. Or if I want the feeling of um, getting to feel worshipped and adored, and I can get my polypod to come together and pretend that I am some, goddess and they're all my concubines, right? Like there's so many ways that you can get creative about how to get those feelings met. And so when I'm working with my clients and they're wanting to share fantasies, what we actually do is we start to explore, well, how do your fantasies have you feel? Because
Hmm.
feelings are so much more vulnerable. They're easy to connect with. They're less scary for the receiver to hear. So if I say to you, Kitty, I have this fantasy and I imagine that it would have me feel just so special and important and precious. And I want to share it with you. And I'm not attached to having to happen, but I think it could be so fun to explore different ways and fantasies that I could have these feelings.
Mm.
And that just like opens it up in a way that just removes pressure for everybody involved.
Hmm. Allie, I love everything that you shared, and I love how you put language around it because that's going to be so incredibly helpful for all the listeners. Like literally, like a how to. How do I do this? And I really hear you when you talk about the feelings. And what I want to walk out too is sometimes it's not just the feelings like when we describe, I feel happy or sad. It's also like the butterflies, right? Like if you feel the butterflies in your stomach or your heart like racing, that's exciting.
Mhm.
And to me,
Mhm.
it's so again empowering to know that just through fantasy alone, including like sharing fantasies, like writing an erotic story with somebody, like going back and forth, like somebody writes the first section and then the next person writes the next section and ooh, what are they going to say next? And feeling those sensations in your body, it's fascinating. And especially during a pandemic, right? Like fantasy and sharing fantasies or creating erotica in that example is such a way to connect on a powerful level and to still experience pleasure, even if we're not even touching each other. It's fascinating, right?
It's so incredible. Yeah.
And I think that's amazing. And I hope a lot of the listeners can really walk away with that. There is another question I'd love to ask you that's from my community. I definitely, a lot of the work that I do is very focused on sex positivity, partly because we do grow up in a very sex negative world. And a lot of times I'm helping folks maneuver through jealousy and insecurity and comparing themselves to others, and they have difficulty stopping their brain from maybe feeling inadequate. If we're in an open relationship and now you're having sex with other people, what if they're better in bed than I am? What if they're more well endowed than I am? And so it's a question that's come up in my community is how to kind of maneuver through that, get to the other side of that comparison game and maybe get to a more sex positive place. And that's one of my last main questions for you. Do you have any insights from your expertise and your experience to help somebody who's kind of navigating through that?
Yeah, I think that jealousy is just such a challenging emotion. And what you already pointed to is that it's often a composite of so many experiences, feelings and fears of inadequacy, insecurity. Maybe it could even be a sense of loss or anger or betrayal. And I think that what's really helpful is to notice, what is the fear? What is the missing experience or the need? What is the reassurance that you're wanting? And to be really honest about asking for it and leaning in and um, being a co creator of getting the reassurance that you need. And I think that what we can do to be a really generous lover and partner is take the time to kind of come up with our own user manual and share it with our
Mm,
partner. So what are some things that are really helpful for me to hear when I'm feeling jealous? Or what are some things that are really helpful for me before you go or when you come back so that I can feel connected and reconnected with you? And what are some of my core fears that come up so that you know exactly kind of where to go with the reassurance or where to be tactful and gentle because it might rub up against something that's a wound for me. And
mm,
so I think that it's doing the self exploration and then having the courage to be vulnerable and direct and creating a relationship norm where it's okay and even healthy and a positive to ask for the reassurance that's needed.
mm. I love that answer so much. I love how you really highlighted asking for what you need and like from a place of self-mastery, like doing that self-exploration. And I also love how you highlighted the leaning into courage and leaning into vulnerability, which is really a strength to be able to then, share that with your loved one who, normally they want to be there for you. They want to meet your needs. Yet somehow we have that fear anyway, and being able to move through it and get the reassurance that you need or get your needs met. So beautiful answer. I really love that.
Thank you.
Well, then I'd love to just take you into the lightning round. It's just some questions I like to ask, and you might touch on something you've already touched on, or you might just give us drop some wisdom bombs real quick here. So the first question is, in your journey through your life and your work and your consensual non-monogamous adventures, what's maybe either the best advice you've ever received or maybe the best thing that you've done along your journey that you felt really helped you?
I think the best piece of advice I've gotten that I think is probably one of the pieces of advice I've repeated the most is oftentimes when you think you have incompatible needs, it's just a crisis of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And I really love that quote because it applies so much to the topic that we've talked about today, because I think that we can feel like there's no way that I'm going to get those feelings in real life, or there's no way that that fantasy is going to happen in my real life. And I think that oftentimes that's just a crisis of imagination. And how creative can you get about ways of using role plays and other kinds of forms of fantasizing to allow yourself to find ways to make some of those incompatible needs more compatible.
I love that. What a great share. And I couldn't agree more. Beautiful. How about, what tip would you share with somebody who is either possibly trying to maybe open up a relationship, or maybe if they're not in a relationship, maybe they're struggling to just live their most authentic life, like maybe lean into their sexuality, something along those lines?
I think the most important thing is to educate yourself. And that can look a variety of different ways: podcasts, books, workshops and classes, seeking out coaches and therapists. But I think that in order to make non-monogamy work, we need to have mentorship, we need to have community support and guidance. And I think the same thing is true for folks that are wanting to explore other aspects of their sexuality that feel challenging or scary to do so, is to not be afraid to get the support.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah, I like being courageous enough to reach out for help, and yeah, including if that means doing research or finding a mentor or somebody like you to help them. 100%.
Yeah. Or you.
Thank you. I love that. How about, is there a book, movie, or resource that you can recommend, maybe that helped you along your journey, or you just feel very confident sharing with our listeners?
I really like the book Love in Abundance by Kathy Labriola. I think it's just such a wonderful and kind of under-acknowledged guide to exploring non-monogamy.
I didn't even know that. And I've actually had Kathy Labriola on the podcast. I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So it mainly touches on non-monogamy?
That's right.
Beautiful.
And how to navigate open relationships.
Nice. Okay. I'll check that out. Thank you. And for fun, lastly, is there a particular song or music that really moves you or inspires you?
Oh, I'm a funk fan. I think that there's certain music that I hear from the outside in, and then there's certain music that I feel from the inside out. And I would have to say funk is that genre that does it for me. Probably Stevie Wonder's Superstition would be my go-to jam.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Well, this has just been so amazing, Allie, and I'd love it if you shared with our listeners, how can they best find you, find your work, and anything else that you'd like to share.
Yeah, thanks. Well, my website is www.turnon.love, and you can go there to find all of the courses I teach, all the podcast episodes I've been on. I have a bunch of resources and handouts available. You can also contact me for a handout on different erotica resources. I'd be happy to share those with you so that you can use them to expand your fantasies. And then I have a course on fantasies that I offer called Free Your Fantasies that might be interesting for our listeners. And then the other thing I want to put on the radar is a 10-week course I'm offering called Sexual and Emotional Intimacy Skills that I teach at Stanford University. And I'm really excited to bring it out of academia and to offer it publicly. And it has 10 virtual classes that incorporate science-based data, embodied exploration, lots of skills development, and go over a wide range of topics that I think are essential for being able to have healthy emotional and sexual intimacy. So we do talk about fantasies, but we also talk about consent and boundaries and how to care for our nervous system and how to create emotional depth and safety and flirting, seduction, maximizing pleasure, masturbation, intimacy in the COVID era, how to repair conflict in relationships. I mean, just the list is it's pretty comprehensive. And so if you go to turnon.love, you can check it out. It's called Sexual and Emotional Intimacy Skills.
Your enthusiasm and passion is just infectious. I love it. It's so great. And I love the name Turn On Love. What a great name for your website. That's awesome. Well, I just can't thank you enough. This has been absolutely fascinating. I've riveted everything that you shared here. I'm delighted that you're in the world sharing all of your beautiful gifts. Mm-hmm. And I love knowing more about what you offer so that when, I have somebody that I would like to refer to you to know all the depths and the wisdom that you have and your expertise. So thank you for sharing it here with our community. And I'm just so filled with gratitude that you were able to take the time out to share all of that with us.
Oh, thanks, Kitty. I just have to say, it was such a joy speaking with you and getting to geek out. And I really love the way that your brain works. And I'm so grateful for the work that you do and for creating this podcast and platform and community of educators. It's just such a needed thing in this world. I'm really appreciative.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful journey and it brings me a lot of joy. And one of the ways it brings me joy is to just get to have these incredible conversations with people like all over the world. So I love it. And I'd be happy to have you back on the show. I think you have a lot to offer. And I'd love to have you back on someday.
Let's do it.
The Loving Without Boundaries podcast is brought to you by Alt Playground. Visit their website at altplayground.net. Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you heard, are struggling with some aspect of your relationships, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit to work with me as your relationship coach, here's what I invite you to do next. Head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. That's lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply and book a call to speak with me. I'll get on the phone with you for about 45 minutes and we'll get you crystal clear on 3 things. Number 1, exactly what's not working well in your relationships right now. Number 2, ideally where you'd like to be and what might be getting in the way. And number 3, the exact strategy to get you there, helping to close that gap. Remember, creating healthy, open relationships does not typically happen by itself. Many often need expert guidance to make it happen. We've helped clients all over the world to feel safe, happy, and secure in open relationships while not losing their mind or their cherished partners. To see if we can help you do the same, head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. I'm Kitty Chamberliss, and let's talk soon.